Hello and welcome to the Everything is Black and White podcast live on our Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter channels, and later on our podcast channel. I'm Andrew Musgrove, joined as usual by our Newcastle United editor Aaron Stokes. If you are watching on YouTube, hit that subscribe button, and if you're listening later on our podcast channel, thanks for tuning in. Remember to follow and like the podcast and leave us a rating and review if you get the chance. Aaron, as it seems with Newcastle of late, this isn't going to maybe be a podcast full of joy, happiness, hope, and any other word you want to throw in when you're in a good mood. Newcastle have been hit by injuries. They were suffering before the international break. There was some optimism when Bruno returns, and then he left the pitch against Bournemouth. Turned out Eddie Howe admitted that he played him for longer than he had initially hoped for. He went away with Brazil, as did Alexander Isak with Sweden, Chris Wood with New Zealand, and the bad luck just continues. We will start with Bruno Guimaraes, who has left the Brazilian camp. Just give our listeners a bit of insight into what is going on, what the injury is that he suffered, and does it rule him out potentially for the game against Fulham this weekend?
Yeah, so Bruno's a bit of a tricky one. He picked up an injury last week when he went out to international duty, a different injury than he'd been suffering, obviously, in recent weeks where he missed those 3 Newcastle games. So he's picked up a thigh injury. There was a bit of swelling in his left thigh. And, the Brazil doctors took a look last week. He was assessed at the team hotel. He missed the 3-0 win over Ghana on Friday. He was on the bench, but it was sort of always known that he wouldn't be featuring in that friendly win. And they've now made the decision to send him home rather than keeping him in the squad for Tuesday's game. So, I think the positive is that, he's came back. He's already been at Benton today. He's been in the gym doing a bit of solo training. But I think, the fact that Brazil thought he wasn't going to be fit enough for tomorrow's game is a bit of a worrying sign as to whether he'll be fit enough or not for Saturday.
Because he's absolutely crucial, isn't it, to what Newcastle want to achieve. But I think we need to see him getting a few games under his belt. So this little setback, even if it doesn't rule him out for this weekend against Fulham, it's still a setback Newcastle would rather not had.
100%. I mean, I think you've lost so much creativity in that midfield with Shelvey gone. Even though Newcastle struggled against Bournemouth, there was a notable, it was noticeable how much they moved the ball better in midfield when Bruno plays. Someone who's just going to sort of take the game by the scruff of the neck. And you think, going down to Fulham, which will be a tricky clash on Saturday, they've started really well. And I think, going into that game without without Bruno, is going to be a real challenge for them if he can't make it.
Now, the other big injury concern is that of Alexander Isak, a man who has started his Newcastle United career very well, scored 2 goals since his move. Did look a little isolated against Bournemouth, and the last episode we chatted about the system and what have you. Does Eddie Howe persevere with this system that is definitely suited more to Callum Wilson than it is to Isak or Chris Wood, or does he change it up? Now, given the fact that Isak has also left his camp, the Swedish camp, very early on in this international break, there are genuine concerns that he could be ruled out for a few weeks, which would just be a huge blow, even with Callum Wilson believed to be returning in time for that Fulham game.
Yeah, a huge blow. Different sort of injury to Bruno, and the severity looks very different given that Sweden wasted very little time sending him home. Isak picked up the injury last Tuesday, trained by himself for Sweden, and they sort of took an early decision that he wouldn't be fit enough to play those 2 Nations League games on Saturday or Tuesday. So Isak returned home a lot earlier last week. There's general fears that he's probably going to miss more than Bruno, which is a massive blow given he's sort of hit the ground running in the sense that he scored 2 goals in his first 3 games. Yes, his link up play and his overall game hasn't been amazing, but he's had a good start, and I think with Wilson back, it would have been good to see that partnership. But it looks like we may have to wait a couple of weeks to see that now.
What does this do for the mood within the dressing room? We know, some Newcastle United fans while not on the back of Eddie Howe or the team, they're still, and quite rightly, wanting more points on the board. It hasn't been the best start of the season, even though Newcastle have only lost once. Losing your star striker at a very start of the campaign, isn't it? Because ideally you want Callum Wilson coming back in with Isak there, fit and raring to go. And just when things seem to be on the injury front picking up, we are then getting the news that XYZ is injured, and it's Newcastle's luck is just it's not very good at the moment. But what do you think it does for the mood within the camp?
Look, I think the mood overall is generally good. I don't think there's anyone too disgruntled. I think there's a lot of frustration. Eddie Howe admitted that after the Bournemouth game that they're sort of as a group they're frustrated that they haven't got more points on the board. They've just been very, very unlucky at the start of the season, and it's such a shame that they had a relatively good transfer window in the sense that they strengthened where they needed to. The one weakness was they didn't get enough depth in. We all said it, they needed probably one or two more bodies. And really, they've been exposed so much earlier than we thought. We always said that there's question marks about Wilson, and 3 games in, it goes to show it. He's out again. Anderson picks up an injury. Maxi misses 4 games. Bruno's out, and obviously there's a lot of talk about getting another midfielder in when Shelby drops out. I think they've just been exposed really a little bit as to how they needed another body in the summer.
Does it, in a way, work maybe as a blessing in disguise? Because what it does, it sets the pulses race for January. It gets those that have been planning, for a long while, but what happens in January gets them maybe standing a bit more to attention when they go, okay, maybe it's not just about, getting the very best in. Maybe we do need to just get another body in who necessarily might not be a first team player, but he will add to the squad. Because, as you say, they look exposed now. Because let's say Callum Wilson isn't fully fit to start against Fulham. You then turn to Chris Wood, who himself has picked up an injury for New Zealand, a rib injury, which, again, if he needs to be used on Saturday, you would think, and this is just me reading between the lines, that he would have to play through the pain barrier to make it, because a rib injury, they are painful injuries to pick up. So, like you see after that, where do they turn to?
Well, this is the thing, you're looking at other options, and really there isn't any. You would think, if Maxi was fit, he could maybe do a job, but we've seen he doesn't play, his best football when he's used as a sort of out-and-out striker, as Howe's used him a couple of times. In terms of January, I think they're already working on it. I think Eddie Howe came out right after the summer window and basically said, we were really trying it until the last day. He knew they needed 1 or 2 more bodies in. There was no sort of venting from him. There was no frustration. It's not in public that he didn't get the bodies in. He sees it as a good window, but there's already work going on behind the scenes. We know that Dan Ashworth are already scouting, potential options for January, and they know, given how hard it was in the summer, we know that they're going to be making sure that January, which is an even harder window, is that they're making sure that they're getting stuff done early.
Looks maybe having a little bit of trouble with your audio, so we'll try and fix that. You may have there's the joys of doing it live. I think we're back on there, so give us a shout. Hopefully you can hear Aaron when I ask him the next question. We do apologise for that. That is the curse of going live. It is, one potentially good thing is that St. Maximin's been quite vocal on Instagram talking about his next celebration, but even he's not guaranteed to be back this weekend. There's still a few reports of doubts here and there whether he'll be ready to face Fulham.
Yeah, there was the hope that he would be back for Bournemouth along with Wilson. Wilson was strictly a case that Eddie Howe didn't want to risk him, whereas for St. Maximin, he did suffer a setback with the physios earlier that week, which has sort of delayed his return. From what we understand, as of this morning, it looks like, there's no guarantees that we'll be starting on Saturday or that he'll be back. But, if you're going off his social media and if you go on what he certainly thinks, he seems to think that he's going to be back. We know that, he's used his break. Eddie Howe give the players a bit of time off at the start of the international break, and Maxi used to go over to Monaco to get, some sort of one-on-one work done with a trainer. I've seen a couple of clips from that training session, and he looked very, very sharp. So look, hopefully, Howe and the Newcastle doctors give him the all clear for Saturday, because I think even more so than Bruno in the last couple of games, he's been the player we've missed, because we say it every week. Almiron and Fraser will do all the running in the world, but they just don't seem to have that that killer instinct. And I think that's why we probably haven't seen the best of Isak so far, is because he hasn't actually had the type of service that we think Maxie's shown in the first couple of games this season.
Now we've fixed the audio, just go back in and we'll just quickly re-answer the question on Chris Wood. He's picked up an injury, and potentially what it means for options aside from, well, the three strikers who are there, Isak, Wilson and Wood, and what it means for January as well.
Yeah, I think obviously Chris Wood suffered an injury yesterday. He only played 33 minutes of New Zealand's defeat to Australia. He came off, said that he felt like someone had popped in his rib, and he was struggling to breathe. So you think if he does manage to get fit on Saturday, he'd be playing very much through the pain barrier, which obviously isn't ideal. And yeah, just as what we were saying for January, I think Newcastle was sent a clear message in the summer, which was meant to be the easier of the two transfer windows to get deals done. And that was that clubs, we're going to make it very, very difficult to do deals with them. So I think we already know that Ashworth and Darren Eales, and they've appointed a few more people behind the scenes to try and make sure that they get the right deals done, and very, very early in January. So it is a reminder to them that they're short, but I do think Eddie Howe and his backroom team knew that going into the last couple of games.
And I guess the issue is with these injuries as well, especially with Wilson and St. Maximin. They're kind of injuries which are probably going to reoccur at some stage as well. So it's not just about getting them fit, it's about wrapping them up in cotton wool. So if Callum Wilson is back on Saturday, there's going to be so much work going into making sure that he gets through the 55, 60 minutes. And then the work really begins to make sure he's ready for the game after that, the Brentford game, the game that follows that game, because, he is so unfortunately injury prone that one little, step turn, he could be out for another 4 or 5 games.
I think Eddie Howe in an ideal world would want to do what he did with Bruno last week at Bournemouth, and only give him, ideally an hour. At the minute where we're standing, it probably doesn't look like that's going to be an option, because if Wood and Isak don't make it, which they might not, we're very, very limited options. But this is the thing with Callum Wilson, you've got to balance it so finely. But at the start of the season, he was absolutely flying, he looked fit as a fiddle, and then we just know that it can go. So it's a real dilemma as to what he does Saturday. Wilson looks the most positive out of all the players that have been sidelined. We know he's very, very close to making the squad against Bournemouth, and they made a late call not to. What do you do? Do you give him 90 because you haven't got any other options? Do you give him 60 and have to just do a sort of makeshift, attack when he comes off? It's an interesting one, but I think a lot of it will probably depend on how he's feeling, and also how the game goes. If Newcastle are level pegging at 0-0 on the hour mark. We saw it last week with Bournemouth, where Howe said he wanted to give Bruno an hour, but because they weren't winning, he felt he had to eke a little bit more out of them. And look, I'm not saying that's what's caused this injury this week, but if anybody's going to get re-injured, it's going to be Callum Wilson. So they need to be very, very careful with him this week.
Probably is what a big test of Callum Wilson's character, in terms of he will want to play. You've seen Ivan Toney get an England call up, and he'll want to be within a chance of getting his own call up for the World Cup. And you do maybe wonder if it comes down to, like, not 50-50, but something where he's not feeling 100%. Will Callum Wilson be honest and say, look, I'm not feeling it today? Or will he think he's got a sense of duty to the to himself and to the club to say, do you know what, I'll risk it, which in the long term could actually prove the wrong decision.
I think Callum Wilson, and knowing Callum Wilson and how much he loves his football, I think he'd be saying, "No, I'm fit to play," which we know probably wouldn't be the best idea. But he's the type of player that will run through brick walls, and I think if Newcastle United desperately need him this Saturday because they've got no other option, I think he would be fine to play. But Eddie Howe's not like that. Eddie Howe will not want to take any risks with him. And we know with Callum Wilson, there's so many risks sort of attached to him. And yeah, it's just a shame that he can't be eased back in. It would have been great to see him get back up to fitness, start Isak for an hour, then play Wilson. It just hasn't happened like that, and that's just the way it goes. Newcastle have just been very, very unlucky in the last couple of weeks.
I mean, if you're Eddie Howe and you're sitting there this week, and every time the phone rings, you'll be thinking, "Oh, who is it now?"
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, I mean,
frustrating.
yeah, I mean, the very first day of the international break, he had quite a boost in this fact that Botman withdrew and said, he wanted to focus on Newcastle rather than going to play with the Netherlands under 21s. And he thought, that's a brilliant start. It's one less body to get injured. Little did we know, 3 days later, 2 or 3 of the best players are now looking to be sidelined.
And does it also highlight as well, maybe what's to come within the youth ranks? Because at this point, when you've got your number 9, he's probably not match fit. He might be fit, but he's not going to be match fit. You've got your £60 million striker out injured for maybe a few weeks. You've got your third place striker also not 100% fit. You would then hope you can turn to a striker in the under 23s, under 21s, but there just doesn't seem to be anyone to step up at the moment. I know Elliot Anderson's there and thereabouts, but he's not a forward player in terms of an out-and-out striker. You have to hope that maybe that it's another, wake-up call. And we know Dan Ashworth and Eddie Howe, they want to improve the youth system, but it's another wake-up call to maybe move it up a gear, because they haven't got any other options after these 3 strikers.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we've seen the work that they've done over the summer with buying not just top class first team players, but putting a real emphasis now on buying the best youngsters in the country. You look at Charlie MacArthur from Kilmarnock, you look at Jordan Hackett who left Spurs, Alex Murphy from Galway, all fantastic young players, but admittedly all defenders or goalkeepers or midfielders. So you do look at that under 23 squad who have had quite a poor start to their Premier League 2 campaign, and there isn't really a standout player you would think that could make the step up, especially not in that attacking position that they need. So, look, as you say, it is probably an area that Ashworth are looking at and thinking, yeah, you know what, we could maybe do with getting a really young, talented under 23 striker that could make the step up, just as Elliot Anderson has in that different position.
I mean, the hope will have to be that Anderson is available for the game against Fulham. Do we have any update on him? Do we think he'll be there or thereabouts?
Anderson, as we understand that he probably should be fit. Eddie Howe was very, very quick to clear up after Bournemouth that it was a very minor niggle. It didn't look like that. He trained for about 10 days beforehand, but it's not been described as serious by the club. So hopefully, as you say, he's not an out-and-out striker, but any attacking option at this stage would be welcome. So Anderson back, you would hope. Wilson looks like he's going to be back in the fold. Maxi touch and go. If Isaac and Bruno hadn't been injured on international break, you'd be going into Fulham quite confident. Obviously, it hasn't worked like that, but it looks like all the players that were missing before the international break will be very, very close to at least making the bench on Saturday.
I think one thing you'll get as well, and this will probably backfire when we hear Eddie Howe's press conference on Friday, but
don't jinx it, please.
For now, he's not using this as an excuse, is he? He's not using the injuries that were there before, and I don't think he'll use the injuries that they've picked up now. He may mention it in a passing comment because he will have to, someone will ask him about it, but I don't think, as previous managers will have done when they've gone through a horrible run of luck when it comes to injuries and their best players missing, will use it, as that first and foremost reason why, touch wood, this doesn't need to be out, but why they've lost to Fulham, for example.
Yeah.
And I think that's Eddie Howe, and that's why I think Newcastle got such a good manager there, because it's all about the players that he's got to pick from. Yes, it's annoying that Callum Wilson hasn't played for 3 weeks or Isaac's picked up this injury, but he can't do anything about that on Saturday. So he has to get the best out of the players that he's got, and I think that's a really good trait of Eddie Howe.
Oh, 100%. I mean, he has mentioned it. The injuries have been, it's no secret. We ask him about it. He responds about it. He knows that they've been terribly unlucky. But as you say, he's never once used it as a, this is why we've only won 1 out of 7. This is why we keep drawing games. I'm sure he's thinking that behind the scenes. But Eddie Howe knows and Jason Tyndall knows in his backroom team, they know that they just have to find the best alternative, and that it can't be an excuse that they're missing key players, they're not winning games. So Howe will be working his arse off on the training ground to make sure that they're really, really doing all they can to win. When they haven't got Maxi, when they haven't got Wilson, when they haven't got Isa.
Yeah, most certainly. I mean, we've got Kieran Trippier, Nick Pope involved in the England setup. Obviously not the best in terms of results for England, but good to see them involved, and it sets the standard of the kind of players Newcastle United are targeting. It's been a long time since they've had players in the international setup with England, and even though it's not gone particularly well in terms of results, it is great to see Newcastle having a couple of players involved.
Oh, 100%. I mean, I think I saw some very silly stat on Twitter the other day that, Newcastle United haven't had an England number one in their ranks for about 100 years. So, look, fantastic for Pope, fantastic for Trippier. Whether they're going to play too much in the World Cup, we don't know yet. But just being around that group, it'll breed confidence in them, especially Nick Pope. I mean, Trippier's been there, done it at tournaments. But for Nick Pope, who is now Newcastle United's out-and-out number one, must be a huge confidence boost for him, knowing that, Jordan Pickford's got injured in the last couple of weeks, and he's the first, he was the one that was called on over Ramsdale. It's yet to be seen whether he'll do the same tonight against Germany. You would probably expect that he drops out. But yeah, really, really good. I'm actually sitting here hoping that they both don't play tonight, because I just think if we lose any more players, then we're not going to have a team. But yeah, really, really good to see them involved, and hopefully both in the World Cup in a month's time.
Back to Newcastle, they've appointed a first team data analyst. Andrew Forrester comes in, decades of experience, with various companies making tools, developing tools that produce the data to make sure you get the best results on and off the pitch. And it's just another step by Newcastle to ensure that every advantage they can possibly have to make this team, to make this club as good as it can be and as competitive as it can be, it's been done.
Yeah, I mean, they're really, really pushing the boat out in terms of making sure they've got the very best of the backroom staff in. And I mean, look, Premier League clubs have been doing this for years with data analysts and jobs like that. Newcastle United are playing catch-up a bit now. But yeah, really good to see that they've got another body in, someone who's going to work really closely with Ashworth and Howe to make sure that they're getting the right type of players in. We know that Andrew Forrester, who they've just brought in, he's previously worked with other Premier League clubs to make sure they've got a certain model which will help their decisions when they're bringing players in, as to, will they fit in with the playing style? Will they fit in with, the ethos of the club? So yeah, look, another really good appointment. I think, you look at, this backroom team that they've assembled. Yes, we don't know too much about Andrew Forrester, but really, really good to see that, they're making sure they're giving themselves, the best opportunity. And I say they are playing catch up. Premier League clubs have been doing this for a while. It's no secret, but it'll give Newcastle United, a real boost when it comes to January and next summer and beyond.
Billy Anthony Garris asks, is it true that Newcastle are planning a raid on Leicester City to get a midfielder? As various reports on social media, we know they were interested in James Maddison. Yuri Tillemans was another one linked, and it said that Graham Jones could be the secret weapon to potentially getting that deal done. I mean, Leicester are they're in a bit of a mess. I'm not really sure how Brendan Rodgers is still in charge there. In a way, I guess it's nice to see clubs going against the usual path where most managers probably would have been sacked by now after saying what he said about transfers and then the results that they've had so far. I mean, they'll be over the moon to have kept Tielemans and Maddison. I think Maddison's really shown over the since the season started, really, just why Newcastle was so keen for him, but equally why Leicester were so keen that if they were going to sell, it was going to cost Newcastle a very pretty penny. Brilliant attitude from Maddison. He's had all that, sort of transfer business swirling over the summer. And as you say, from the first minute that, the ball's been kicked, he's been fantastic. Just on Billy's question, we know that they've looked at, many Leicester players, the two we've just mentioned, Harvey Barnes earlier in the summer, which they were priced out of.
Tielemans, I think, is a hard one because you've got a player who could arguably walk into 18 or 19 of these Premier League teams. He's going to have options. He's out of contract next summer, which means clubs can go from in January for nothing. A lot of European teams will be after him. He'll be wanting Champions League football. That might prove just a little bit too soon for Newcastle. Maddison, we know they really, really liked him in the summer. They were priced out, but his contract isn't out until 2024. But if Leicester are really struggling in January, you could see Newcastle going back in for a bid straight away, because it looks, from what we've seen so far this season, as Newcastle have been crying out for a number 10 like Maddison in their team. So I wouldn't be surprised to see them go back in for him in January over Tielemans. But I think unless Leicester massively drop their valuation of Harvey Barnes, I couldn't see that one happening. But there's options there to go and try and steal a decent addition.
And I think what we'll see is exactly what we saw in the last year at Newcastle when it comes to transfers, and it's them sticking to the same 4 or 5 names and just continuing to test the water. You look at everyone they've signed, they've been somewhere on that list of targets, and they may have not been first, second, or third, but they were on a certain list. And again, I think that's something to applaud, because as we've said many times, it'd be so easy just to throw the checkbook at things. But what they're looking for is not just someone with talent, but with the right character, who applies themselves right, who can handle everything that comes with being a Newcastle United player, everything that comes with all the attention that is on Newcastle at the moment. And I do think we'll see a very similar, if not the same approach, where when Newcastle go back in the market in January, do not be surprised if it is a name that was linked either this summer that didn't get, or back in January earlier this year.
Yeah, 100%. I think Botman was the perfect example. In the summer, they went from in January, they were sort of priced out or told that it wouldn't happen in that window. But, they kept at it, they laid the groundwork, and then, they got the deal done. Clubs, as Eddie Howe have said, were really, really stubborn with Newcastle in the summer. Tried to, make it very, very hard for them to do deals, whether that's because, they see them as a threat or whatever reason. Newcastle United, just like with the Maddison deal, stuck their guns. They weren't going to be prepared to overpay. And you could potentially see them going back in January and maybe getting a cheaper deal, when a club maybe pushed, under a bit more pressure to sell. So I completely agree. I think we'll see a lot of names linked in January that were linked over the summer. And this time they'll probably get some of them.
Sean asks if it's 50 million, if that's not enough for James Maddison, how much do you go for? How much do you pay for him?
I mean, if you look at the market now, I think worse players than James Maddison are going for 50 million these days. I think at the time, Newcastle were trying to play hardball a bit and get a cheaper deal. Leicester, thinking that Leicester had to sell, Leicester really did well to stick to their guns. I think around £50 million is fair for Maddison. I think we've seen already this season and what he's done. I think it's crying shame that he's not in that England setup under Southgate. I think 50 million. I think if that's what Leicester, charge you in January, I think if I was Newcastle, I think I'd be snapping that up.
One to watch, and we'll just finish briefly. You mentioned there Southgate again, and yet again the rumours have surfaced that Eddie Howe was among the favourites to replace Gareth Southgate if the FA decide that he's not the man. You can't see Gareth Southgate going before the World Cup, and then you're into January, and Eddie Howe will undoubtedly have room to manoeuvre in the January transfer market. So you can't then see Eddie Howe wanting to leave Newcastle, and I don't believe for a moment Newcastle would be open to letting Eddie Howe leave their project.
Look, I think Eddie Howe in England would be, a good fit. I think it would suit him. I think he would get the best out of this crop of young players. But I also think, as we said the other week on the podcast, Eddie Howe, only working part-time just wouldn't suit him at all. He's the first one at the training ground in the morning. He's the last one to leave. And I just think, managing 2 games every couple of months just wouldn't be up for him. So, look, I'm not saying that it won't happen, but I don't think he would ever choose to leave this Newcastle United team at this present moment for the England job. I think when it comes to England, Southgate's lucky in the sense that there's a World Cup in 2 months' time, because I think if this was a year where there wasn't a tournament, I think he'd probably be away. I think he'd probably be sacked. So I think, the FA have giving him a contract till 2024. I can see him staying beyond the World Cup. Maybe if they don't perform in the World Cup, he goes and they revisit it. But I can't see how leaving, you know, leaving this Newcastle United project to go and take over England when there isn't a tournament for another 2 years.
Fingers crossed. Roger Cook says that his family are now settled up here, he won't move again. Sean says snap Madison up for 50, definitely. But Southgate, what a joke. Fingers crossed the Eddie Howe stays with us. Well, chaps, that has been the Everything is Black and White podcast. Thank you very much for tuning in. Please remember to like and follow the podcast through your podcast provider. And head over to chroniclelive.co.uk to keep you up to date with all the latest Newcastle United news.